So we're back in 1 Thessalonians. We are in 1 Thessalonians 4 again, and we have a very, very short text today. And many sermon series go through this and kind of just skip this part or include it with the text that we had last week. But as I was reading it, I thought this deserved to be a separate section and a separate sermon, and it's 4 short verses that we have to talk about today. And I'm going to start reading it, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 9 to 12. Paul writes, "Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you have no need to have anyone write to you. For you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And indeed, you do love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we have directed you, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one." A few short verses. It's a separate section in what Paul writes, and that's why we can't just ignore it or attach it to other verses. As we talked about last Sunday, we're in the part of the letter where Paul is kind of giving instructions or advice or perhaps even admonitions, and he started that section with a prayer where he reminded or prayed for the Thessalonians to have love, to have holiness, and to have hope. And for that to define their lives. And then he talks about the section on bodies and sexuality that we talked about last Sunday, and that I'm very relieved to be done with. And then he moves on to something else, and we know he moves on because he puts that now in, now concerning, which means we're moving on to a new thing. Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, concerning love for you in your congregation, for your brothers and sisters, I don't really need to write you, but I'm going to write you anyways. To tell you that you've kind of become famous for it in Macedonia, which is the province in which Thessalonica is located. So there's other churches that are not in Thessalonica, but in the same province. And people are talking about the congregation of Thessalonica and saying, wow, those people, they're loving. So Paul says, I don't actually really have to write to you about this, but I will anyways. You yourselves have been taught by God to love one another, and indeed, you love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia, but we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more. So keep loving, keep going. You're known for this already. And what we miss when we're reading it in English is we're missing that he's using 2 different words in Greek for love. One is brotherly love and sisterly love, or familial love. It's the kind of love that you have for your parents and your brothers and your sisters, for the people in your family. And we all know family is not always easy, but we do love them most of the time. It's that kind of love, and he's saying you should have that kind of love for the people in your congregation. You should have that kind of love for your friends that are also Christians. And then he goes on to talk about another type of love. You have been taught by God to love, and that word love is agape, which is this kind of self-giving love that God shows on the cross. It's basically giving everything up for another person that doesn't deserve it, which is what Jesus does on the cross. He gives everything up. His whole status as God's son, his whole being God, he gives up to die on the cross for us who don't deserve it. That kind of love. So you don't need to tell us. I don't need to tell you, Paul says, about what it means to love like people are your brothers and sisters. And God is teaching you what it means to love by giving everything up for somebody who doesn't deserve it. And I want to just pause there for a second, because I really, really noticed what Paul is saying here. You know, previously Paul has kind of said, imitate us as we imitate Christ. So that kind of that path of discipleship. So imitate us, because we're already been on that walk with Christ a little bit longer than you, and you want to be disciples. So imitate us, and we'll walk together on this path, and you can learn from us. And as you learn from us, you also learn from Christ. And that's kind of this thing that we do in congregations and in churches. That is what we do with our kids. Right? We let them into the mistakes we make. We let them into the good things that God has shown us in our lives, and we kind of hope that they will, as they imitate us, they don't just imitate our mistakes, but they also learn from us and become more Christ-like in their being. And this is what we do when we invite youth into our congregation. It's what we do when we invite new people to become Christ followers. But here, Paul kind of switches, and he says, about love, we have nothing to tell you because God is teaching you. I've been told that I sometimes preach too much about love, but it's really hard when the Bible keeps talking about love. And sometimes I think we talk about love as something that we should do. One of the things that Jesus tells us to do, we know that God is love. But Paul is saying here that if you're walking with God, and he's previously prayed for holiness, and we've talked about holiness basically being God's character in our lives. So if we're walking with God, one of the things that God is teaching us is what love is. One of the things that God is teaching us is what love looks like in everyday life. So it's not just a matter of making a list and saying, this is love and this isn't love. This is how I love and this is how I don't love. And maybe at the end of the day, draw like a nice little balance sheet and to say, was I loving today or was I not loving? It comes out of a lived relationship with Jesus Christ and therefore with God. It comes with the Holy Spirit being in our lives and being part of our being so that our being is transformed into who God is so that people can see who God is through our love. And so Paul is saying, God is teaching you how to love. And then I realize how hard that part is, especially when life doesn't go as I planned. Especially when things fall apart. And it can just be simple things. Like trying to fix a stroller and breaking it. And all of a sudden, you're not a very loving person to be around. And all of a sudden, you're also not praying to God, God, show me what it means to love in this moment. I've told you before how I deal with people who cut me off in traffic, right? So we all know that this is all very simply said. But what happens when life falls apart around us, when it gets worse than strollers? What happens when you can't meet in your church building anymore? What happens when you feel lonely and alone and persecuted? What happens when you're dealing with sickness and things that are ripping apart your joy to live? And all of a sudden you say, I don't feel loving today, and Lord, I have a right to not love today because it's not going my way. I don't want to be taught by you today on how to love. Because my life is not great right now. What's happening is not great. What's happening in the congregation is not great. What's happening out there is not great. A list of things that we could talk about. And that's why it's beautiful that Paul is writing this to the Thessalonians, because the Thessalonians have all the excuses in the world. They're a church plant whose church planter has to leave after a month. And all of a sudden, they're without a pastor. They're without somebody who can teach them. These are not people who've walked with Jesus their whole lives. These are people who met Jesus, who were starting to figure this thing out, and then the person who introduced them has to leave because they're persecuted. This is a group of people who doesn't have a status in society, but instead has to figure out how to remain faithful in a new faith that they know is to be true, while at the same time also somehow surviving the society that they live in. And you would forgive them, I believe, if they weren't known for their love at that moment, but instead just known for their survival skills. But instead, they're known for their love, not just in Thessalonica, but in all of Macedonia. And there's reports coming back to Paul about that church. There's something special. The love they are showing in a difficult situation, that's something special. I think that's something we all have to work on. I think it's oftentimes easy for people to come to church and see the pastor preach about something and say, oh, the pastor, well, he's just in the Bible. He's telling us. But does he know what it means to live? Does he know what I'm going through? He seems so holier than thou up there. We're all trying to figure this out every step of the way in our faith. Because our natural disposition oftentimes is to skip love in order for self-preservation or any other number of things. And it's funny, it's interesting that Paul on this one issue isn't saying imitate us. Because he probably has issues with that sometimes too, like we all do. He's saying, let God teach you. But that means you have to be open to God teaching you. It means that God has to occupy space in our lives, and it means that we have to let God occupy that space even when we don't want Him to occupy that space. And then, seamlessly, Paul moves on. See, I would expect now another kind of transition word, a but, or another for, or now. But instead, in the same sentence that he's still talking about love, he keeps going. In my Bible, there's only a comma, and in the Greek, there is no punctuation marks like that. It's just one sentence together. We urge you, beloved, to do so more and more. He's talking about love, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your affairs, to work with your hands as we have directed you, so that you may behave properly towards outsiders and be dependent on no one. He's done with love, and all of a sudden we're talking about what it looks like to live in a society, to live in a place like Thessalonica, to live in a city like we live in, to be contributing members to society. And how to do that in a Christian way. Live quietly. Mind your own affairs. Work with your hands as we have directed you, so that you may behave properly and be dependent on no one. Live quietly. Mennonites, as they started out as Anabaptists and then Mennonites later, oftentimes were known as the quiet in the land. It was something that Mennonites aspired to. We're going to live quietly, we're going to work hard, and we're going to follow God, and we're not going to make waves. We will be known by our actions, more so by how much we influence through our words or through being involved in politics or whatever it be. We were the quiet in the land. And we've taken that from some of these verses like this. But what's going on here in Thessalonica? There's a lot of talk about that. A lot of commentators have written different things. Some commentators think that there was some sort of apocalyptic movement moving through that congregation where people were saying, Jesus is coming any moment now, let's not work. Others are saying perhaps it was more of a spiritualistic thing where people were saying, well, our bodies don't matter so much, hence we're just going to focus on the spirit and going to leave all this worldly thing behind us. And perhaps that makes sense as you connect it with the talk about sexuality and bodies from the previous Sunday. We have no idea. What we do know very specifically is that some people, a bigger group within that congregation refused to work. Not because there was no work, but because they didn't want to work. We know that very specifically because in chapter 5 of 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes about people not being idle. So if Paul writes about that, that must be an issue, right? So there must be some idle people. And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 6 to 13, Paul writes this. He writes, "We command you, beloved, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to keep away from believers who are living in idleness and not according to the tradition that they received from us. You know to imitate us. We were not idle when we were with you. We were working. We didn't just come and preach, but we also worked. We lived in the workers' quarters. We did things. This was not because we don't have a right to just be supported by you, but in order to give you an example to imitate. For even when we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, not doing any work. Now such persons we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work quietly and earn their living. Brothers and sisters, do not be weary in doing what is right. So, some people are refusing to work, which is actually not that surprising, regardless of what the motivation is. Work was not universally seen as something good in Greek and Roman societies. Work was seen to be something that people do that can't do anything else. Work was something that you had to do to survive, but if you were a citizen of Rome, if you were somebody that had value in that society, they would try to get other people to do work for them. I have a quote here from Aristotle, who's a Greek philosopher, and he writes this: "A state with an ideal constitution cannot have its citizens living the life of mechanics or shopkeepers, which is ignoble and inimical to goodness. Nor can it have them engaged in farming. Leisure is a necessity both for growth and goodness and for the pursuit of political activity." I have another quote from Cicero here that kind of says something similar. I'm not going to do that. Cicero was a Roman philosopher. Aristotle is a Greek philosopher. The whole point is that there was this hierarchy of people, and the better you were, the less work you did, and you spent your time in political activity, you spent your time in philosophizing. You know, there's times in Paul's travels that he goes to the place where everybody gathers in the middle of the day to argue and discuss, right? And he's telling stories. I mean, this is what the people that were something in town did. So conceivably you could see, and this is not in the Bible anywhere, this is just an assumption, but conceivably you could see that if you become a Christian and you have the right faith, you found the right God, the only God, you could kind of maybe tell yourself, hey, I've reached this level of enlightenment, why do I still need to do the menial stuff that the menial people do? I've met God. I'm a son and a daughter of the King. Why should I have to do work? It's just an assumption that I'm making. It's just a conjecture that I'm making. Whatever it is happening that's kind of fitting within that society, and Paul says, that's not what you're called to. You're not called to philosophizing and politicizing. You're called to be quiet, to work with your own hands, to not be a burden on other people. That's how I grew up. That's what I was taught. That's what most of us were taught. I have the beauty always of having some people sit here. They're doing music, and some of you were kind of shaking your heads and laughing as I was reading that quote. And that makes sense because it's so foreign to us to see the world in that way. And yet when Paul is writing this, it almost seems a little bit selfish to me. As I was doing some research, I came across this German saying. In German it says, "Wenn jeder an sich selber denkt, dann ist an jeden gedacht." If everybody thinks about themselves, everybody is thought for. And that's kind of what it seems what Paul is saying here. It's a very German saying, by the way, this idea of like, if we're all selfish, then we're all taking care of ourselves, right? And it's kind of almost what Paul seems to be saying here. Just take care of yourself. And I'd like him to say something about taking care of others, and I think he's done that already when he talks about love. But he's also talking about this idea of taking advantage of others when you become idle. Especially within a congregational setting where some people are working and some people refuse to work, you could very quickly see that the people who are working and have some money could become benefactors of the ones who don't have any. These churches would all meet together to eat every week. By the way, should we start that? I think we should. They would meet together to eat every week, but in a society of scarcity, and that's what it was, not everybody had a lot. And not most people in these congregations weren't rich. There might be one or two that were wealthier, and we know there's at least one or two in this congregation because they were able to pay bail. But most people would be menial workers who are doing little work. And now they're bringing food to share, and a whole group is not bringing anything, but they're still coming for the meal. And you know how quickly you can get into some petty arguments and that kind of stuff. And Paul is saying, listen, you might be becoming known for the wrong thing. This is not what we want to be known for. In a society that disdains work, we want to be known to be workers, hard workers. We're not asking you to go and get involved in the city politics of your city. Live quiet lives. Work hard. Don't play the games that the other people play. You will be known for your faith if you do that kind of stuff, to mind your own affairs. Perhaps we need to rehear that. I think we need to rehear that. I was always asked, since I got here 4 years ago, I was asked to preach on work. So let me go on a little bit of a tangent on work here. It's only taken me 4 years to get there, friends. I thought about this the other day because my daughters watch me go to work every day. I'd never thought about that when I was a kid, but I've realized that work is just such a concept they don't get. Why would anybody leave their house and their families to go work? They know I work at church, they know the congregation, they know the church, they know the building, but just this concept of work as a kid is not something that makes sense, right? A kid is there to learn and play and explore the world, and their greatest desire is to do that together with their parents, and then the parents have to go and work, and then you can explain to them why we do it so that we can have food on the table, and so we can survive, and so we can get you these toys, and we can do this, and you can do this, and we can do this. Except none of those explanations, at least from what I see, are in our text today. And I think this is where we lose ourselves with work. We start talking about work not as a vocation. And so when I talk about vocation, I'm not saying that your specific work is the only thing that you are called to do. But when we see work as a vocation, it connects with our larger vocation to be reflectors of who Jesus is. Reflectors of who God is. We move into this world, and when people see us, they should be seeing God. I mean, that's what the church is. The hands and feet, the body of Christ in this world. And so that's why we are called to work, to be the quiet in the land, to mind our own affairs, to work, because when we do that, we reflect God's goodness and graciousness, and in this case, very specifically connected to love. And I think that's how it started for us Mennonites when we started talking about work. And it's easy to talk about that like that when you're in a persecuted place. And for a long time, Mennonites were persecuted, and the Baptists were persecuted. So when you went to work, you had a real cost of doing that, and you weren't doing it to make money or to have a good life. You were doing it because you were called to do it, and you might lose your life at any moment anyways. But what happens is as we move from being a persecuted people to people that find a space, that find a place in society, I think we've started talking about work as something that benefits us, not something that we do out of vocation. I know some of your objections right now as I'm talking, and I can't read minds, but I know some of your objections, and I will address one of them soon. But hear me out. We've started seeing work as a means for a comfortable life. We started seeing work as a way to get from point A to point B. And when we got to point B, we said, I deserve this because I worked so hard for it. And we used our faith to underscore that. God has rewarded me for my hard work. I deserve this. I don't see that anywhere in this text. There's nothing about deserving when Paul talks about work. Neither in that other text that I read from 2 Thessalonians. Work is not about the outcome. Work is about doing what God calls you to do out of love. That's what Paul says. And here's the objection I hear you yelling at your screen. It's not bad to have things, is the objection. And I agree. I love things. I've told you I like ice cream. I also like steak. And I like when other people have jet skis and invite me to use them. It's not bad to enjoy lives. I'm not arguing for an ascetic kind of lifestyle. What I'm talking about, though, is the motivation, the fuel for what we do. What is it that fuels us? Because when things fuel us, they also impact how we respond to other people. And one way that I've seen this is not exclusive to this congregation. This is not even exclusive to just North Caledonian. This is not even just exclusive to North America, because I see it over and over again, that as a people that is persecuted kind of moves into a stage of not being persecuted and amassing wealth. And even wealth is not the issue. The issue is when we do everything for the sake of just that wealth. We also turn towards other people and see them as commodities, as somebody that stands in the way where I want to get to, or as somebody who's just trying to take away what I so richly deserved. That's why we talk about others sometimes in terms of saying, and I can't tell you how much in my 34 years of life, I've heard this. I worked so hard to get here, and they want it for free. We forget that it wasn't our work that got us where we are. It's God's grace, God's love. Do you notice how our conversation shifts? It shifts from God was with me to I did this. It shifts the conversation away from love. It shifts the conversation away from seeing others as brothers and sisters. Instead, as people who may impact our status, our wealth. So once again, the issue is, of course, not that we have wealth. I work so that I can buy steaks and ice cream. I also happen to work because I enjoy my work, because God called me to do this specific thing. And not everybody can be a pastor standing on the stage. I wish I was standing on the stage preaching. But hey, as I'm looking around this room, we have people studying, we have social workers, we have painters, we have music teachers, we have people cleaning people's houses. Those are all places that God has called you to, regardless of whether you have fun to do it every day. He's called you to be a Christ follower in that place. He's called you to live a quiet life, working with your own hands, so that others see you. He's called you to do that out of love. The kind of love that treats others like brothers and sisters and that gives everything up for them even when they don't deserve it. Even when you had to work harder to get to the same point. Work is important, and we have something to offer to this world. But work comes out of love. It comes out of Jesus' self-giving. It comes out of a relationship with God. And because of it, work is not an end to itself. Work is not something we just do for the sake of work and for the sake of getting something out of work. Work is something that we do because Jesus sends us out into this world. And if we do get some rewards, God is freeing us up to enjoy them while at the same time saying, what are you going to do with the gifts that I gave you? So we enjoy it. We go and eat our steaks and ice creams, sit on our jet skis, make ribs on the barbecue. What else do we do? We have a house full of things that we could do. We go and enjoy it. And at the same time, we proclaim that it's all pure gift, nothing we deserve. And that part of what we get is also given back. That's work. That's what we're called to. That's how we redefine for our society to engage with work, a society that sees work as something to get through in order to achieve a better life. A society that is often so profoundly unhappy to be working. So that's what I read when I read Paul. That's how I read those words for us today, because we know so little else of what's going on in Thessalonica. But when I read Paul talking about work and connecting it with love, I can't help but having to readjust my own relationship to work. That I'm not just doing it because that's what adults do. I'm not just doing it so that I can make bacon and eggs on Saturday morning. I'm doing it because that's what God has called me to do, to proclaim His name. It happens to be literally on a pulpit in church, but it can be anywhere else. So, may I encourage all of us to reorient our relationship to work. I know it's hard. May I encourage all of us to maybe aspire to less. Perhaps it's good enough to work hard, live quiet lives, pray deeply, let God teach us to love, and live in the hope that a new world is on its way. May I encourage us to engage church in the same way. To not just see church as another place where I have worked hard enough to deserve a certain outcome. But instead, for church to be just another place where we live quiet lives, refuse to be engaged by the polemics, and pray deeply that God would show His love through it, through this place we call church. I believe we have another song, and then we'll have a prayer of benediction.